and to a certain extent, we've covered some of this in just the conversation about that first job. But as we go through Roosevelt's Economic Bill of Rights, the second was the right to earn enough to provide adequate food, clothing, and recreation. And you've spoken to that in terms of what would be the compensation for these jobs. But the right of every family to a decent home. That is something that we certainly don't seem to accept in this country. And we're seeing, at least in the context of the Trump administration, an assault on public housing policy.
Yes, and it's our thinking that the capacity to have a decent home would be improved if we could ensure that no one was exposed to unemployment and no one was exposed to poverty. And we think of the job guarantee as pointing in that direction, because it gives us the capacity to ensure that there's no one who wants to work who's not able to find a job. And it also enables us to ensure that every job provides people with a wage that's adequate to provide them with a decent standard of living. So that decent standard of living presumably would include the capacity to rent a home or to rent an apartment or to own a home or own a condominium.
Is there a need for further government intervention in that respect? Because, I mean, if I hear you correctly, the idea would be that we're going to shore up the demand side, but on the supply side, theoretically, it's possible that having more people who can afford to pay what is on Monday a market rent, by the time we get to Friday, maybe that rent has gone up. I mean, are there other provisions in terms of what the government would do to ensure that every family had a decent home?
Yeah, so I think that one of the ways we can think about this is that we would still need to have some form of provision of housing for moderate incomes. But the other thing is we could make use of the public sector employment corps to actually upgrade the 17 million vacant housing units in the United States. They could be redesigned and upgraded, and they could be made available for purchase at prices that would be reasonable for individuals with the lower incomes or the lower folks at the lower end of the income distribution. So we could actually use the federal job guarantee as a mechanism for altering the supply of housing in a positive way.
And number 4 on the Roosevelt list of Bill of Rights, the right to adequate medical care and the opportunity to achieve and enjoy good health. I want to note that it says the right to adequate medical care as opposed to the right to have access to medical care. Access has become sort of that word that can mean anything to anybody these days. But actually having adequate medical care means that you actually get the medical care, not that you have access to it under certain circumstances. So
that you get the service. Yeah. No, that's exactly right.
And so that would include obviously some form of universal health care coverage. But how do we then ensure that people actually get the care? Because we have a lot of consolidation amongst hospitals now and medical facilities. We have doctors who don't necessarily service all communities. What would the government do at that point to deal, and presuming for a moment that other factors lead to some form of universal Medicare for all, let's say, maybe it's the job guarantee that does that. But how do we ensure that there's actually medical care deliverable to all people?
So I guess I've always thought, maybe incorrectly, that it was the dollar sign that was the barrier, not some absolute shortage of available medical services. So you may want to correct me on that, but what we're trying to do is to create a structure in the U.S. economy via the job guarantee that would take the dollar sign out of the capacity of individuals to get medical services.
I guess my concern would be the accessibility of the existence of actual care in certain areas, and maybe in the context of if you have a rural community, I don't know, in West Virginia, and there's enough people who are working there, then maybe facilities become available because there's people who can actually pay for it, or there's a mechanism to pay for it.
Yeah, and I think, you're pointing, I think that the idea of the kinds of work that could be done under the federal job guarantee is only limited by our imagination. And what you're talking about suggests to me another arena in which it would be possible to put people to work under the federal job guarantee, which is, the possibility of developing clinical services in underserved areas. So, this would require, of course, recruiting physicians, but there's a wide range of staff positions that could be fulfilled by people who might be employed under the federal job guarantee without having undergone the same type of training that physicians, nurses, or PAs undertake. And so, there's another possibility to help establish and staff clinical facilities in areas that are currently lacking in healthcare services.
Roosevelt had the notion also for the sixth right to be the right to a good education, and you flesh that out as including UPK, universally around, universal pre-K, and we enjoy that here in New York City. And I think it has not received the attention probably that it should in terms of the implications. And we haven't quite seen the educational impact yet. But I mean, I think New Yorkers who have a kid in pre-K certainly know what it means economically. And this also includes some form of, I guess, a free college option at the for higher education. So let's move on to three that you three have added, and we'll be talking about Betsy DeVos a little bit today.
Well, let me say one thing about the education right, though.
Please.
This is a case where I think we do need a constitutional amendment, because there's no constitutionally guaranteed right to quality education. There are some individual states that have that written into their constitution, but it is not a national condition. And I think that that's one that probably does need to be written into the Constitution via an amendment.
Well, now, why do you feel that it needs to be, as opposed to the others?
I think that the symbolism, and given the decentralized nature of our public school system, the capacity to have that lever to demand that all local communities provide a sound, high-quality education for all young people is essential. I view it not exclusively as symbolic, although the symbolic purpose is valid, but also as leverage.
And we need this in this arena as opposed to, let's say, I mean, because I guess there's a similar dynamic like with voting on some level, perhaps.
Right.
The absence of a constitutional right to vote makes it much harder to make sure that there is parity in the way that people have access to the ballot across the country.
Right. There's too great a degree of discretion leading to variation and inequity in the voting process. And I think that the same is true for the provision of public schooling.
And we should say, obviously, it's much harder to make that determination from a schooling standpoint, right? We can assess what's going on in terms of voting rights basically by looking at one piece of paper about what the statutes are that are and what the barriers are within a certain state. When we start talking about community schools, it's very difficult to sort of assess and then apply standards as opposed to start with a baseline.
Well, I think we've developed a substantial number of metrics, and we have to make sure that we use the most sensible and wise ones. But there's a vast array of metrics available for assessing the quality of schooling, and those metrics are linked to various dimensions of student performance. We may not want to rely exclusively on the vaunted test scores, although I'm not so sure that test scores are a problem. It's the question of what is the content of what's being tested. It's not just the test scores in and of themselves that's a problem. So, but I think we have lots of options for coming up with reasonable criteria for assessing the quality of schooling.
I don't want to get too hung up on this, but why couldn't we also simply say, as opposed to having to try and cross the threshold of making a constitutional amendment, I'm certainly not against that, but in terms of knowing the limitations of our politics, and maybe this is just as far-fetched, but if we change the funding mechanism of schools and federalize it more, so that it can relieve pressure on schools to get their money from local taxes, from property taxes. Couldn't we tie in those federal funds in the same way that we might, highway funds in some way, where we say, okay, the federal government is now going to fund public schools, and if you want to be eligible for this money, you have to hit these certain baselines.
Yeah, so that's definitely not an idea that I reject at all. But there is another issue, which is what I call the educational redlining that takes place against Black students, Latino students, and by educational redlining, I mean that within a single school facility, there is segregation in terms of the curriculum and the instruction that students receive. And I think that by changing the funding mechanisms for schools, you don't get at that issue at all. You have to have some commitment to a universal standard of quality of schooling for all kids to be able to have some way of pressuring schools and school systems to make sure that they meet the needs of all students and that they meet the needs of all students in such a way that all of them are exposed to a high quality curriculum. So the altering the funding mechanism, I mean, we have really well-funded schools that still have internal segregation in the sense that I'm describing based upon racialized tracking. And so I think that just would not be sufficient to change the funding mechanism to get at those issues.